Success isn't the money you earn, the waitress said quietly. It's the life you don't have to escape from. The words landed so gently that at first no one at the counter seemed to notice them. A coffee machine hissed somewhere behind the bar. A fork clinked softly against a plate. Outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly past the diner's wide front window, tires crunching on loose gravel. But Daniel Whitmore noticed. The billionaire's hand stopped halfway to his coffee mug, fingers frozen in midair as if the sentence itself had reached across the table and pressed pause on the world around him. 5 seconds earlier, the moment had felt ordinary. Just another stop on a long highway drive. Just another roadside diner somewhere off Interstate 91 in a quiet Vermont town most people on Wall Street had never heard of. Maple Creek had 1 stoplight, 2 gas stations, and a diner that smelled like buttered toast and fresh coffee from 6 in the morning until closing time. The kind of place where locals knew each other's names and strangers were easy to spot the moment they walked through the door. Daniel Whitmore had been that stranger. His charcoal gray Mercedes had looked almost out of place parked between a rusted Ford pickup and a faded Subaru wagon in the gravel lot. Inside, he had taken a seat at the counter without saying much, scrolling through emails on his phone while the waitress poured him coffee in a thick white mug that had probably been in the diner longer than some of the customers. Her name tag read Emily. Emily Carter. She looked like someone you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Mid-20s. Light brown hair tied loosely behind her head. No jewelry except a thin silver ring. Her uniform was simple, a pale blue shirt, dark jeans, and a white apron tied at the waist. She moved with quiet efficiency, refilling cups, sliding plates across the counter, greeting regulars with easy smiles. Nothing about her suggested she belonged in the same conversation as a man whose company managed billions of dollars in investments across the globe. Which was exactly why Daniel had asked the question in the first place. It had started as a joke, a moment of boredom while waiting for his omelet. He had glanced up from his phone, studying the room with the detached curiosity of someone used to observing life from behind glass. A couple in their 70s shared a slice of apple pie near the window. A truck driver read the morning paper beside a steaming plate of pancakes. And the waitress, Emily, stood pouring coffee for a construction worker still wearing a dust-covered jacket. Daniel had leaned back slightly on his stool and said, almost casually, "Tell me something. What does success mean to someone in a town like this?" He expected a simple answer. Maybe a laugh. Maybe a polite shrug. Most people, when they realized who he was, tried to impress him or agree with whatever they thought he believed. But Emily didn't rush. She placed the coffee pot down gently on the counter. She wiped a small ring of spilled coffee with a folded napkin. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, with calm, thoughtful eyes. And then she spoke. "Success isn't the money you earn," she said softly. "It's the life you don't have to escape from." The diner didn't go silent in a dramatic way. No one dropped a plate. No music stopped playing. Life inside Maple Creek Diner continued exactly as it had before. But inside Daniel Whitmore's mind, something shifted. Because in 39 years of boardrooms, negotiations, interviews, and endless conversations about wealth and ambition, no one had ever answered that question quite like that. And suddenly, the small-town waitress standing behind the counter didn't seem ordinary at all. Daniel Whitmore did not move for several seconds after the sentence left Emily Carter's lips. The diner continued breathing around them, ordinary and steady, but something inside the billionaire had quietly shifted. He slowly lowered his hand and wrapped his fingers around the warm coffee mug, though he had forgotten completely that he intended to take a sip. His eyes studied the young waitress more carefully now, as if seeing her for the first time instead of the background figure he had assumed she was when he walked in. Emily had already turned slightly away, reaching for the coffee pot again and refilling the construction worker's cup without any sign that she had said anything remarkable. Her movements were calm and practiced, the small routines of someone who had worked the same counter long enough to move almost without thinking. She slid a plate of scrambled eggs toward another customer, wiped the counter with a folded cloth, and smiled politely when an older man thanked her for the extra toast. Daniel watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. Most people, after delivering a line like that, would wait for a reaction. They would glance back to see if the words had landed the way they hoped. But Emily did not look at him again. It was as if the sentence had not been designed to impress him at all. That realization unsettled him in a quiet way he could not immediately explain. Daniel Whitmore had built his life in rooms where every sentence was a move in a larger strategy. Investors spoke carefully. Executives chose their words like chess pieces. Even compliments were often disguised negotiations. But the waitress behind this small-town diner counter had spoken without hesitation, without calculation, and without any visible desire for approval. He cleared his throat slightly, the sound soft but deliberate. Emily returned to his side of the counter with the coffee pot in her hand. Up close, Daniel noticed something he had missed earlier. Her eyes carried a stillness that did not quite match the restless rhythm of the diner. They were attentive but not nervous, thoughtful without appearing distant. The kind of eyes that seemed to observe more than they revealed. She refilled his mug before he even asked. The dark coffee flowed into the cup in a steady stream, steam rising gently between them. Daniel leaned back slightly on his stool, folding his arms with a faint smile that carried more curiosity than amusement now. That is an unusual answer, he said. Emily set the coffee pot down on the counter with a quiet tap. Most people expect unusual answers when they ask unusual questions, she replied. The remark was not sharp, but it was precise. Daniel felt the corner of his mouth lift a little higher. Across the diner, a bell rang softly from the kitchen window as another order was ready. Emily turned, retrieved the plate, and placed it carefully in front of a waiting customer before returning again to the counter. Daniel remained seated, watching the rhythm of her work. A few minutes passed before he spoke again. "Let me try another question," he said calmly. Emily rested her hands lightly on the counter, patient but not hurried. Daniel studied her expression for a moment before continuing. "What about failure?" he asked. "What does failure mean to you?" For a brief second, Emily looked past him through the wide front window where the Vermont morning sun had begun to warm the quiet street outside. Then she returned her gaze to him, thoughtful and composed, as if considering the weight of the question before allowing the answer to exist. Emily Carter did not answer immediately. For a moment, she simply rested her hands lightly on the counter, fingertips touching the smooth surface that had been polished by years of quiet mornings and familiar routines. The sunlight outside had grown brighter now, spilling through the diner windows and stretching across the floor in long golden lines. Somewhere near the back booth, an elderly couple shared a quiet laugh over their coffee. The world inside Maple Creek Diner continued exactly as it always had, but Daniel Whitmore found himself leaning forward slightly, waiting. Emily glanced once more toward the window before looking back at him. Her expression remained calm, thoughtful rather than guarded. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet steadiness as before. "Failure," she said slowly, "is when you wake up every morning chasing a life that never feels like your own." The sentence settled between them just as gently as the first one had, but its weight was unmistakable. Daniel felt a faint shift in his posture again, a subtle awareness that this conversation had moved far beyond the casual curiosity that started it. For years he had listened to analysts, consultants, economists, and advisors discuss success and failure with graphs, projections, and numbers that stretched across entire conference room screens. Yet none of those explanations had sounded quite like the one delivered by the waitress standing across from him in a small Vermont diner. Daniel studied her for a moment, his curiosity sharpening into something deeper now. "You speak like someone who has thought about this a great deal," he said. Emily gave a small smile that carried neither pride nor apology. "Small towns give people time to think," she replied. She reached for the coffee pot again and refilled the cup of the truck driver seated 2 stools away. The man thanked her with a nod, completely unaware that the conversation happening beside him had quietly captured the attention of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Daniel rested his elbows on the counter, folding his hands together. The faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter blended with the distant clatter of plates in the kitchen. "Let me ask you something else," he said after a moment. Emily looked back at him, patient but not curious in the way most people would have been. "Do you enjoy working here?" Daniel asked. The question sounded simple, but something in his tone suggested he was searching for a deeper answer. Emily followed his gaze briefly across the diner. She looked at the couple sharing pie, at the truck driver reading his newspaper, at the quiet street outside where the morning traffic consisted of a single pickup rolling slowly past the gas station. Then she returned her attention to Daniel. Yes, she said. The response came easily. Not rushed. Not defensive. Just certain. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. You say that very confidently, he observed. Emily wiped the counter with a folded cloth, her movements unhurried. People often assume a place like this is temporary, she said. Like it is just somewhere you stop on the way to something bigger. Daniel felt the corner of his mouth lift slightly again. That assumption had been his exactly. Emily placed the cloth down beside the register and looked directly at him. But sometimes, she continued gently, people discover that bigger is not always better. Sometimes bigger just means louder. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly for a moment after she said that. And for the first time since he had walked into Maple Creek Diner, the billionaire began to suspect that the most interesting person in the room was not the one sitting at the counter. Daniel Whitmore remained seated at the counter long after that last sentence settled into the quiet air of the diner. Bigger just means louder. The words circled through his mind in a way he had not expected when he first asked a simple question out of boredom. For most of his life, bigger had always been the goal. Bigger offices, bigger deals, bigger numbers on quarterly reports. Entire cities measured success that way. Entire industries depended on it. Yet here, in a small Vermont town with one stoplight and a diner that probably served the same breakfast menu for 20 years, a waitress had just reduced that entire philosophy to a single calm observation. Daniel lifted the coffee mug and finally took a sip. The coffee was strong and simple, nothing like the expensive blends he usually drank in glass offices overlooking Manhattan. But it tasted honest in a way he had almost forgotten coffee could taste. Across the counter, Emily Carter continued her work as if the conversation had not shifted the atmosphere between them at all. She rang up a check for the elderly couple near the window and thanked them for coming in. The man left a few dollar bills beside his plate and tipped his hat slightly before they stepped out into the bright Vermont morning. Daniel watched them through the window as they walked slowly toward a small blue sedan parked near the curb. You seem very certain about your ideas, Daniel said after a moment. Emily returned to the counter, placing the cash into the register before looking back at him. Certainty is usually just experience wearing comfortable shoes, she said lightly. Daniel smiled at that, a quiet reaction that surprised even him. Most people spent entire conversations trying to impress him with complicated theories or impressive credentials. Emily spoke with the kind of clarity that made complicated ideas feel simple. Daniel rested his forearms on the counter again. Tell me something honestly, he said. Do you ever wonder what your life might look like somewhere else? Emily tilted her head slightly, considering the question in the same thoughtful way she seemed to approach everything. Somewhere else like where? She asked. Daniel gestured vaguely toward the road outside. A bigger city. New York. Boston. Somewhere with more opportunity. Emily followed his gesture toward the street. A delivery truck had stopped briefly near the gas station. A teenager rode past on a bicycle, balancing a brown paper bag in one hand. The town moved slowly, quietly, the way it always had. When she turned back to Daniel, her expression remained peaceful. Opportunity is an interesting word, she said. Most people use it when they really mean pressure. Daniel leaned back slightly on his stool, studying her again with growing curiosity. You do not sound like someone who feels limited here, he said. Emily shook her head gently. Not limited, she replied. Focused. The answer hung between them for a moment. Daniel Whitmore had spent decades surrounded by people chasing the next step, the next market, the next expansion. Yet the waitress standing across from him spoke about staying in one place with the quiet confidence of someone who had already found something others were still searching for. And for the first time that morning, Daniel realized he was no longer asking questions to entertain himself. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand. Daniel Whitmore remained quiet for a few moments after Emily said the word focused. The diner felt slightly different now, not because anything around them had changed, but because his attention had shifted in a way that made the small details of the place stand out more clearly. The soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. The faint ticking of a wall clock above the kitchen window. The scent of toasted bread drifting through the warm air. For years his mornings had begun in glass towers where elevators moved faster than conversations, and people measured their days and meetings scheduled 15 minutes apart. This place moved at a different rhythm entirely. Emily picked up a stack of clean plates and placed them neatly beneath the counter before glancing back at him. You are thinking very hard about something, she said with a small smile. Daniel exhaled softly, almost amused that she had noticed. I spend most of my life thinking about expansion, he replied. Growth. Opportunity. Bigger markets. Bigger results. Emily rested one hand on the counter, listening without interruption. Daniel looked around the diner again. And yet you stand here talking about staying in one place as if it is the most natural decision in the world. Emily's smile grew slightly warmer, but it still carried that calm certainty Daniel had begun to recognize. That is because people often misunderstand what staying means, she said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. How so? Emily reached for a small notebook tucked beside the register and flipped it closed before answering, as if finishing one small task before beginning another thought. Staying somewhere does not mean you stop growing, she explained. It just means you decide what kind of growth actually matters. Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing the words. Most people would say success means reaching as far as possible, he said. Emily nodded once. Yes, that is what most people say. She gestured lightly toward the window where the quiet street stretched through the center of town. But sometimes reaching farther just means moving away from the things that made life meaningful in the first place. Daniel followed her gesture again. The teenager on the bicycle had returned, now riding slowly past the diner with a friend beside him. A dog barked somewhere down the block. It was the kind of ordinary scene that rarely appeared in the world Daniel had built for himself. You speak as if you made that decision deliberately, Daniel said after a moment. Emily did not hesitate. I did. Daniel studied her expression more closely now. There was no regret there. No hint that she felt trapped or limited by the life she had chosen. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that seemed almost unfamiliar to someone who had spent years surrounded by ambition that never rested. Most people in your position would leave the moment they had the chance, Daniel said. Emily folded the cloth on the counter carefully before replying. Most people believe happiness is waiting somewhere else, she said. Daniel felt something shift again at that sentence. The same quiet sensation he had experienced earlier when she defined success and failure in ways he had never considered before. And you do not believe that? He asked. Emily met his gaze with the same calm clarity that had surprised him from the beginning. No, she said gently. I believe happiness is something people carry with them. The problem is that many of them never stop long enough to notice. Daniel Whitmore sat silently for a few seconds after that. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire found himself wondering whether the waitress standing across from him understood success better than most of the people he had spent his life working beside. Daniel Whitmore did not answer immediately after Emily finished speaking. The quiet certainty in her voice lingered in the air longer than he expected, like the echo of a thought that refused to fade. For a moment, he simply watched her move around the diner again, refilling a sugar container, straightening a stack of napkins, greeting a new customer who stepped through the door with a cheerful nod. The bell above the entrance rang softly as the man walked in, bringing with him a brief gust of cool Vermont air. Daniel noticed how naturally Emily shifted from conversation to routine, from thoughtful reflection to simple hospitality, as if both belonged equally to the same life. It was a balance he rarely saw in the world he knew. In his world, people were always leaning forward, chasing the next opportunity before the present moment had even finished unfolding. Emily seemed perfectly comfortable standing exactly where she was. Daniel rested his hands around the coffee mug again, though it had already cooled slightly. You sound like someone who has spent a long time thinking about these things, he said after a while. Emily shrugged gently, a small motion that carried neither pride nor modesty. Everyone thinks about success eventually, she replied. Most people just wait until they are exhausted before they start asking what it actually means. Daniel looked down at the surface of the coffee for a moment, studying the faint reflection of the diner lights in the dark liquid. Exhaustion was a word he understood well, though he rarely admitted it out loud. His calendar was full months in advance. Investors expected answers. Markets demanded attention. Every decision carried the weight of numbers that could move millions of dollars within seconds. Yet sitting here in this quiet diner, the pace of that world suddenly felt distant, almost unreal. You ever read business magazines? Daniel asked after a moment, a hint of curiosity returning to his tone. Emily smiled slightly. Sometimes, she said. Mostly when someone leaves one behind on the counter. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. Then you might recognize my name. Emily tilted her head just slightly, studying him with calm interest. Daniel Whitmore, she said. The name came out naturally, without surprise. Daniel raised an eyebrow. So you do know who I am? Emily nodded once. Your company was featured in an article last month, she explained. Something about expanding into new markets overseas. Daniel felt a brief flash of the familiar recognition he usually encountered in conversations outside the diner. Yet Emily's tone carried none of the awe or caution that often followed his name. It sounded more like someone mentioning a book they had read than someone acknowledging a billionaire. Most people react a little differently when they realize who they are talking to, Daniel said. Emily wiped a small ring of water from the counter and set the cloth aside before replying. That is probably because most people assume money changes the value of a conversation, she said. Daniel leaned forward slightly, intrigued again by the way she framed ideas with such quiet precision. And you do not? He asked. Emily met his gaze calmly. No, she said. Good questions sound the same no matter who asks them. Daniel Whitmore sat back slowly on his stool, absorbing the thought. For a man who had spent decades surrounded by influence, authority, and carefully measured respect, the simplicity of that answer felt strangely refreshing. And somewhere deep in the back of his mind, a realization began to form that the most valuable part of this morning might not be the answers he had heard so far, but the questions he had never thought to ask before. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a few seconds after Emily spoke those words. Good questions sound the same no matter who asks them. It was such a simple sentence, yet it quietly stripped away something that had surrounded him for most of his adult life. Titles, status, expectations. In boardrooms, every conversation shifted the moment someone powerful entered the room. People adjusted their tone, their posture, their opinions. But here, sitting at a worn diner counter in a small Vermont town, the rules seemed different. Emily treated his questions the same way she would treat anyone else's. With patience, with honesty, and without the slightest hint of performance. Daniel rested his hands flat on the counter, studying the smooth surface where decades of customers had placed their coffee cups and plates. You know, he said slowly, most people see someone like me and immediately start trying to say the right thing. Emily gave a small shrug. That sounds exhausting, she replied. Daniel laughed quietly. It can be. For a moment the two of them simply listened to the gentle rhythm of the diner. The kitchen bell rang again as another plate was ready. A pair of college students stepped inside, their voices light with the energy of a road trip morning. Emily greeted them with the same easy warmth she offered everyone else, handing them menus before returning to Daniel's side of the counter. Let me ask you something else, Daniel said, leaning forward slightly again. Why do you read business magazines if you have no interest in leaving this town? Emily considered the question thoughtfully before answering. Understanding how the world works is different from wanting to control it, she said. Daniel nodded slowly. That distinction was sharper than it first appeared. So you follow the news, he said. You read about companies, investments, expansion. Emily smiled faintly. Information is useful, she replied. But usefulness does not always mean direction. Daniel studied her again with growing curiosity. You could have done something else, he said. You speak like someone who went to college. Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she reached for a stack of clean glasses and placed them carefully on a shelf behind the counter. Her movements remained calm, but Daniel sensed a subtle shift in the air, as if he had stepped close to the edge of a story that had not been told yet. When she turned back toward him, her expression remained composed. I did go to college, she said simply. Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. Where? Emily wiped her hands on the edge of her apron before answering. Columbia University, she said. The words landed softly, but Daniel felt them immediately. Columbia was not a school people attended by accident. It was one of the most competitive universities in the country, a place where future executives, economists, and leaders sharpened their ambitions before stepping into the world. Daniel looked at her more closely now, the quiet pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in his mind. The clarity in her answers, the way she framed ideas, the calm intelligence behind every sentence. That explains a few things, he said quietly. Emily gave a small smile, though it carried no hint of regret or nostalgia. College teaches you many things, she said, but it does not always tell you where you should live afterward. Daniel leaned back slowly, absorbing the revelation. The waitress standing across from him was not simply thoughtful. She was educated, articulate, and entirely capable of walking into the same professional world he occupied. Yet she had chosen something else. And suddenly the conversation felt even more interesting than before. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for several seconds after Emily mentioned Columbia University. The quiet of Maple Creek Diner seemed to grow slightly deeper around them, not because the room had changed, but because Daniel's understanding of the person standing across the counter had shifted once again. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees along the street, their leaves flashing briefly in the sunlight before settling back into stillness. Inside, the slow rhythm of the diner continued exactly as before. Plates slid across the counter. Coffee cups were refilled. The college students who had just arrived began laughing over something on a phone screen. Yet Daniel found it difficult to focus on any of it. Columbia University. The words echoed quietly in his mind. He had spoken on that campus twice during fundraising events. He had met professors there, investors, future executives preparing to enter industries that would shape entire markets. It was not the kind of place people simply walked away from without reason. Daniel leaned forward slightly on his stool, his curiosity now fully engaged. Most people who attend Columbia do not end up working in small-town diners, he said gently. Emily did not seem offended by the observation. She simply folded a clean dish towel and placed it neatly beside the register before answering. Most people follow the path they believe they are supposed to follow, she replied. Daniel watched her carefully. And you did not. Emily shook her head softly. I followed it for a while, she said, until I realized something important. Daniel waited. The pause between them felt natural now, like the rhythm of a conversation that had grown more thoughtful with each passing minute. Emily glanced briefly toward the front window again, where the quiet street stretched beneath the bright morning sky. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity Daniel had heard from the beginning. Ambition can be a powerful teacher, she said, but it is not always a good compass. Daniel felt the sentence settle in the same quiet way her earlier answers had. For decades he had treated ambition as the compass itself, the guiding force behind every decision, every risk, every expansion his company pursued. Yet hearing the idea framed this way forced him to reconsider something he had never questioned before. What made you realize that? He asked. Emily rested her hands lightly on the counter again. During my last year at school, she explained, everyone around me was talking about the same future. Internships in Manhattan, consulting firms, investment banks, careers that moved fast and never slowed down. Daniel nodded slightly. The picture she described was very familiar. And you did not want that? He asked. Emily smiled gently, though there was no bitterness in her expression. At first I thought I did, she said. But one afternoon I sat in a park near campus and watched people rushing past in every direction. Everyone looked busy, important, determined. She paused briefly before finishing the thought. But almost no one looked peaceful. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly after that, the meaning of her words settling deeper than he expected. For a man who had spent his life measuring progress in numbers and milestones, the idea of choosing peace over momentum felt almost unfamiliar. Yet standing behind the counter of a quiet diner in a small Vermont town, Emily Carter seemed to embody that choice with a calm certainty that Daniel could not ignore. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately after Emily finished her story about the park near Columbia. The image lingered in his mind longer than he expected. A campus full of ambitious students moving quickly toward futures that promised prestige, money, and influence. He knew that world well. He had lived inside it for decades. The difference was that he had never paused to observe it from the outside the way Emily had. Daniel slowly leaned back on his stool, folding his hands loosely in front of him. Outside the window, the Vermont morning had grown brighter. Sunlight reflected off the windshield of a passing pickup truck before fading again into the quiet street. Maple Creek continued moving at its slow, steady pace, untouched by the urgency that defined the cities Daniel usually called home. Emily picked up a coffee mug from the counter and rinsed it in the sink behind her before placing it carefully onto the drying rack. Her movements remained calm, familiar, unhurried. There was no tension in her posture, no sense that she was missing something somewhere else. And for the first time, that morning Daniel began to understand that this was exactly what she had chosen. "So you left?" Daniel said quietly. Emily nodded once. "I finished my degree," she explained. "Then I came back here." Daniel studied her expression. "That must have surprised people." Emily smiled gently. "It did." She rested her hands lightly on the counter again. "Some of my professors thought I was wasting an opportunity." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what did you think?" Emily glanced around the diner. The college students were now finishing their breakfast. The truck driver had folded his newspaper and was reaching for his wallet. Everything inside the diner felt steady and ordinary, yet somehow meaningful in a way Daniel had not fully appreciated before. "I thought opportunity can mean different things to different people," she said softly. Daniel considered that answer carefully. In his world, opportunity was usually measured in market share, profit margins, and growth projections. Yet Emily spoke about it as if it were something quieter, something personal. "Do you ever regret the decision?" Daniel asked. Emily shook her head without hesitation. "No," she said, "because I did not leave success behind." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Then what did you leave behind?" Emily met his gaze with the same calm clarity she had shown from the beginning of their conversation. "Noise," she said simply. The word hung between them for a moment. Daniel Whitmore slowly looked around the diner again. The soft hum of appliances. The gentle conversations at nearby tables. The warm scent of coffee and toast. None of it was impressive in the way the world usually defines success. Yet none of it felt empty either. Daniel reached into his wallet and placed several bills beside his coffee mug before standing from the stool. Emily noticed the gesture but did not react with surprise. She simply nodded politely. "Safe travels, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Daniel paused near the door before stepping outside. He looked back once more at the small diner, the quiet street, and the waitress who had answered a simple question with a kind of wisdom he rarely encountered in boardrooms or executive meetings. For the rest of his life, Daniel Whitmore would attend conferences, negotiate deals, and expand companies across continents. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he would always remember a calm voice in a small Vermont diner reminding him that real success was not always measured by how far a person traveled, but by how peacefully they could remain exactly where they were.